He thought humiliating her would be easy, but in less than 10 seconds, the entire room would realize they had misjudged the wrong person. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall glass windows of iron core Jiu Jitsu, casting sharp lines across the polished mats as the steady rhythm of drills echoed through the space. Bodies moving in practiced patterns, instructors calling out corrections, and at the center of it all stood Brad Hoffman, the head instructor, confident, composed, and very aware of the authority he carried in that room. He had built his reputation on discipline and dominance, the kind that made newcomers either rise quickly or leave quietly. And today, it seemed, he had already chosen which category Evelyn Carter belonged to. She stood near the entrance, adjusting the knot of her worn yellow belt. Her gray training uniform slightly faded compared to the crisp uniforms around her, her presence quiet enough that most people barely noticed her at first, but Brad did, and the moment his eyes landed on her, there was a subtle shift in his expression, the kind that comes from quick judgment, from assumptions formed in a fraction of a second. "This isn't a beginner's class," he said, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention without raising it, and a few nearby students glanced over, curiosity quickly turning into amusement as they took in Evelyn's appearance, her age, her belt, the calm way she simply nodded instead of responding. The room didn't stop, but something in the air changed, a quiet ripple of expectation, of anticipation, as if everyone instinctively understood that this moment was about to turn into something more than a simple introduction. Brad stepped closer, his movements deliberate, controlled, every inch of him projecting authority as he folded his arms and looked her up and down, not aggressively, but with a certainty that felt heavier than any raised voice. "We train at a different level here," he continued, and a few soft chuckles followed from the edge of the mat, not loud, not cruel, but enough to draw a line, enough to make it clear where she stood in their eyes. Evelyn didn't react the way most people would. There was no embarrassment in her posture, no defensiveness in her gaze, only a stillness that didn't quite match the situation, the kind of stillness that comes from observation rather than hesitation. As if she were taking everything in, measuring it, understanding it in a way no one else in that room expected. A younger student off to the side shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Brad and Evelyn, sensing something that hadn't fully surfaced yet, while Brad, unaware of the shift he had just triggered, gave a small dismissive nod toward the mat. "You can watch for now," he said, already turning away, already moving on, confident the moment was finished, but as Evelyn stepped forward just a few inches, her feet settling onto the edge of the mat with quiet precision, something subtle changed, not in the room, but in the rhythm of it, as if the space itself had paused for a fraction of a second, waiting for something it couldn't yet explain, and somewhere in the back, someone muttered under their breath, "She doesn't move like a beginner." Brad did not turn back right away, but he heard it, that quiet comment from the back of the room, and it lingered just long enough to plant a seed of irritation he could not ignore. He paused mid-step, his jaw tightening slightly before he slowly looked over his shoulder, his eyes narrowing as they settled again on Evelyn Carter, who now stood just inside the boundary of the mat, not fully stepping in, not retreating either, simply present in a way that felt out of place in a room that thrived on hierarchy. The drills around them continued, but less focused now, movements losing rhythm as more eyes began to drift toward the unfolding tension, curiosity pulling attention away from routine. Brad walked back toward her, each step measured, deliberate, as if reclaiming control of a moment that had not gone the way he expected. "Something you want to say?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with challenge, and the room subtly shifted again, the quiet laughter from earlier fading into a more watchful silence. Evelyn lifted her gaze to meet his, not confrontational, not submissive, simply steady, and for a brief second, that steadiness unsettled him more than any argument could have. "I was just watching," she replied, her voice even, respectful, but there was something beneath it, something that did not match the image everyone had already formed of her. A few students exchanged glances, unsure whether to dismiss her or pay closer attention, while the younger woman who had been observing earlier leaned forward slightly, her expression tightening as if she sensed the direction this was heading. Brad let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it. only a subtle need to reassert the dynamic he was used to. "Watching is fine," he said, taking a step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make the moment feel more personal while still allowing those nearby to hear. "But understanding what you are watching takes years." A couple of students nodded instinctively, reinforcing his authority, their agreement almost automatic, but Evelyn did not look away. Instead, her eyes flicked briefly toward the center of the mat where two advanced students had just finished a sequence, their movements sharp but slightly unbalanced at the end, something most would not notice unless they were looking for it. "Your timing is strong," she said quietly, her words directed toward the space rather than at anyone specifically. "But you are overcommitting your weight on the transition." The sentence landed in the air with unexpected weight, simple, precise, and completely out of place coming from someone they had already dismissed. The room went still in a way that felt different from before, not filled with laughter or judgment, but with a kind of suspended attention that no one had planned for. Brad's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough that those closest to him could see it, a flicker of something sharper than annoyance, something closer to disbelief. He glanced toward the students she had indirectly referenced, then back at her, as if recalculating in real time. "That's so," he said, his voice quieter now, more controlled, and the question hung there, less rhetorical than before. Evelyn gave a small nod, not pushing, not elaborating, simply stating what she had seen and leaving it there. That restraint, more than anything, disrupted the balance of the room. Brad straightened slightly, his posture shifting from dismissive to evaluative, and for the first time since she had walked in, he was not entirely certain of the role she was supposed to play. Around them, the class had almost completely slowed, conversations fading, movements pausing, as if everyone understood that whatever came next would not follow the usual script, and somewhere near the edge of the mat, the same quiet voice from before whispered again, this time with less doubt and more certainty. "She is not here to watch." Brad held her gaze for a second longer than necessary, and in that brief silence, something shifted inside him, not doubt, not yet, but a tightening awareness that the situation had slipped beyond the simple script he was used to controlling, and that realization did not sit well with him. He let out a slow breath, then straightened his shoulders as if resetting the balance of the room, his voice returning to its usual calm authority, but now carrying a sharper edge beneath it. "If you have observations," he said, stepping back just enough to create space while still keeping her in focus, "then maybe you should demonstrate what you mean." The words were measured, but their intent was clear, not an invitation, but a test, and the room responded instantly, energy rising, attention locking in, conversations fading into a thick, expectant quiet. A few students shifted their positions to get a better view. Others folded their arms, waiting, curious to see how this would unfold, while the younger woman near the wall felt her pulse quicken, her eyes fixed on Evelyn with a mix of concern and anticipation. Evelyn did not answer right away. She looked at the mat, then at Brad, then at the space between them, as if considering something far more complex than the challenge itself, and when she finally moved, it was not dramatic, not defiant, just a simple step forward onto the mat, her bare feet settling with quiet precision, her posture aligning in a way that subtly altered the air around her. The shift was almost invisible, but those who had trained long enough felt it, not consciously, not yet, but somewhere deeper, like a rhythm changing beneath a familiar song. Brad noticed it too, though he could not immediately place what felt different, and that uncertainty pushed him further into the role he knew best. "All right," he said, gesturing toward the center, his tone now carrying a hint of challenge he did not bother to hide. "Show us." Evelyn gave a small nod, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, and for a moment, nothing happened. The room held still, the kind of silence that builds pressure rather than releases it, every eye fixed on the two of them, waiting for something that no one could quite define. Then Brad stepped forward, not aggressively, but with the confidence of someone who had done this countless times, expecting control, expecting predictability, expecting the outcome to follow the pattern he had seen over and over again. Evelyn did not rush to meet him. She adjusted her stance by a fraction, her weight settling in a way that looked simple but carried a quiet precision, her hands relaxed, her focus steady, And it was in that moment, just before anything actually began, that the younger woman near the wall whispered again, this time more clearly, "Something is different." No one responded, but they all felt it now, that subtle tension, that quiet sense that what they were about to witness would not unfold the way they expected, and Brad, still unaware of the depth of that shift, gave a small nod as if to signal the start, confident that whatever came next would only reinforce what he already believed, not realizing that for the first time in that room, he was the one being measured. Brad moved first, smooth and controlled, his steps measured with the confidence of someone who had repeated this motion hundreds of times, expecting a predictable response, expecting hesitation. But Evelyn did not react the way he anticipated. She did not retreat, did not rush forward. She simply shifted, a subtle adjustment of her footing, a quiet realignment of balance that seemed almost insignificant to the untrained eye. Yet something in the room tightened instantly, as if everyone felt a change they could not yet explain. The space between them closed, not with force, but with precision, and in that brief exchange of movement, Evelyn's hand found his wrist with exact timing, not grabbing, not forcing, just connecting at the precise moment his momentum peaked, and then everything changed. It was not fast in the way people expected speed. It was controlled, deliberate, almost effortless, a redirection rather than a clash, and Brad's confident posture broke, not dramatically, not violently, but unmistakably, his balance shifting off-center, his stance no longer grounded the way it had been just a second before. A soft sound echoed as his foot adjusted against the mat, trying to recover, but the moment had already passed, and in one continuous motion, Evelyn guided that imbalance to its natural conclusion, lowering him onto the mat with a calm efficiency that left no room for resistance and no trace of struggle. The room froze. No one moved. No one spoke. The usual sounds of training, the rustle of uniforms, the quiet instructions, the steady rhythm of motion, all of it disappeared into a silence so complete it felt almost physical. Evelyn released her hold immediately, stepping back with the same composure she had shown from the beginning, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened, as if she had simply completed a routine movement rather than dismantled the assumption that had filled the room minutes earlier. Brad remained still for a second longer than expected, his eyes fixed not on the ceiling above him, but on something deeper, something internal, as if he were replaying the moment, searching for the point where control had slipped away, and finding nothing he could easily explain. Around them, the students stood frozen, their earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain, and then, slowly, the shift began. One student lowered his arms. Another took a step closer. The younger woman near the wall exhaled softly, her eyes wide, not with shock alone, but with recognition, as if something she had sensed from the beginning had finally revealed itself. "That was clean," someone whispered, barely audible, and the words seemed to echo through the silence, not as praise, but as acknowledgement. Brad pushed himself up slowly, his movements no longer carrying the same effortless authority, and when he looked at Evelyn again, the certainty in his expression had been replaced by something far more measured, something closer to respect, though he had not yet found the words to match it. Evelyn met his gaze calmly, offering no explanation, no justification, only the quiet presence of someone who had nothing to prove and no need to speak. And in that silence, the entire room began to understand that what they had witnessed was not luck, not coincidence, but something far deeper, something they had failed to see from the very beginning. Brad stood there a moment longer than anyone expected, the weight of what had just happened settling across the room like a quiet pressure no one could ignore, and when he finally straightened fully, there was a noticeable shift in the way he carried himself, not weaker, not diminished, but altered, as if something rigid inside him had loosened just enough to let a different perspective through. His eyes stayed on Evelyn, no longer scanning her with quick judgment, but studying her with deliberate attention, searching not for flaws, but for understanding, and that alone was enough to make several students glance at each other, sensing that the hierarchy they had taken for granted had just been rewritten without a single word. "Where did you train?" he asked, his voice steady, but stripped of the earlier edge, and the question hung in the air with a different kind of weight, not a challenge, not a test, but a genuine attempt to reconcile what he had just experienced. Evelyn did not answer immediately. She adjusted her sleeves slightly, a small, almost habitual movement, then looked at him with the same calm expression she had carried from the beginning, her eyes clear, grounded, and entirely unbothered by the attention now focused on her. "Different places," she said simply, her tone neutral, offering nothing more than the truth, yet withholding the details everyone in the room suddenly wanted to hear. A few students leaned in closer, curiosity replacing skepticism, while the younger woman near the wall stepped forward just a little, her earlier uncertainty now transformed into quiet admiration. Brad nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging not just her answer, but the fact that there was far more beneath it than she chose to reveal. Around them, the room began to breathe again, but not in the same way as before, the casual chatter replaced by a more subdued awareness, the kind that follows a moment no one expected but everyone understood mattered. One of the advanced students shifted his stance, then cleared his throat softly. "That transition," he said carefully. "It was efficient." He stopped there, as if realizing that no word he chose would fully capture what they had just seen. Evelyn gave a small nod in response, not correcting him, not expanding, simply acknowledging the observation without claiming it. Brad glanced at the student, then back at Evelyn, and for a brief second, something almost like a smile touched the corner of his expression, not amusement, but recognition. "Class," he said, turning slightly, so his voice carried across the mat again, though it no longer held the same unquestioned authority it had earlier. "There is a difference between movement and control." The words landed differently now, no longer a lecture, but a reflection shaped by what had just unfolded. He paused, then added, more quietly, "And sometimes you do not recognize it until it is right in front of you." The room listened, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to. Evelyn stepped back from the center of the mat, returning to the edge where she had started, her presence once again quiet, almost blending into the background, yet now impossible to ignore. The younger woman approached her hesitantly, her voice low. "How long have you been training?" she asked, unable to hold the question any longer. Evelyn glanced at her, a faint, almost imperceptible smile softening her features. "Long enough," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that carried more meaning than the words themselves, something earned, something lived, something that did not need explanation. The room did not laugh this time. No one questioned her place anymore. And somewhere in that quiet shift, the lesson settled in, not spoken, not forced, but understood by everyone who had witnessed it. That strength was not always loud, and the people who carried it the most quietly were often the ones you should never underestimate. The class did not return to normal right away. Even as people began moving again, the rhythm was different now, slower, more deliberate, as if everyone had become aware of details they had overlooked before, and that awareness lingered in the way they repositioned themselves, in the way they watched Evelyn Carter without staring, trying to understand without asking too much too quickly. Brad remained near the center of the mat, his arms no longer crossed, his posture open but thoughtful, as though he was still processing something that did not fit neatly into his previous understanding of control and skill. He glanced toward the students, then back at Evelyn, and there was a pause before he spoke again, not to challenge her this time, but to recalibrate the space itself. "Pair up," he said, his voice steady, but quieter than before, and the instruction carried a different tone, not command alone, but intention, as if he wanted the class to experience something rather than simply perform it. The students moved quickly, though not with the same casual confidence they had earlier, their attention sharper, their movements more intentional, and as they settled into their positions, several of them found their eyes drifting back toward Evelyn, waiting, wondering if she would remain on the edge or step forward again. She did neither at first. She stood where she was, observing, her gaze moving from pair to pair, not judging, not correcting, simply watching in a way that felt more like listening than looking, and that alone began to shift the energy around her. The younger woman approached again, this time with more certainty, her voice still soft, but no longer hesitant. "Would you train with me?" she asked, and there was a brief silence as those nearby caught the question, their attention sharpening instantly. Evelyn looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod, stepping onto the mat without hesitation, her movements smooth, grounded, as if she had always belonged there. They faced each other, and for a second, nothing happened, just two people standing in quiet focus, the rest of the room fading into the background as the space between them became the center of attention. The younger woman moved first, carefully, respectfully, and Evelyn responded not with force, but with guidance, her movements subtle, almost invisible, redirecting rather than resisting, showing rather than proving, and within seconds, the younger woman found herself pausing, not because she had been stopped, but because she had realized something mid-movement, something about balance, about timing, about how little effort it actually took when everything aligned correctly. "Feel that," Evelyn said quietly, her voice calm, instructive without being authoritative, and the younger woman nodded, her expression shifting from concentration to understanding. Around them, the class slowed again, not out of shock this time, but out of attention, watching not for a moment of dominance, but for something more precise, something more refined. Brad observed from a few feet away, his eyes focused, his earlier certainty replaced by a deeper engagement, and as he watched Evelyn guide rather than overpower, correct without criticizing, he began to see the difference he had spoken about, not in theory, but in practice. One of the advanced students stepped closer, unable to hold back his curiosity. "Can you show that again?" he asked, his tone respectful, and the request carried through the room like a quiet shift in status, not enforced, not declared, but recognized. Evelyn paused, then nodded once more, resetting her stance with the same calm precision, and as she moved again, slower this time, clearer. The entire room leaned in, not to judge, not to challenge, but to learn, and in that moment, without raising her voice, without claiming any title, she had become the most listened to person in the room. The movement slowed again, not because it had to, but because no one wanted to miss what came next, and as Evelyn reset her stance, there was a quiet clarity in the way she positioned her feet, the angle of her shoulders, the calm rhythm of her breathing. Details so small they would have gone unnoticed before, but now held the attention of every person on the mat. "It is not about strength," she said softly, guiding the younger woman back into position, her tone even, measured. "It is about where you place it." And as she demonstrated again, slower this time, her hands moved with a precision that felt almost invisible, adjusting rather than forcing, redirecting rather than stopping, and within a second, the imbalance appeared naturally, not created, but revealed, as if it had always been there waiting to be noticed. The younger woman exhaled quietly, her eyes widening with understanding, not because she had been overpowered, but because she had felt the shift happen through her own movement. Around them, the rest of the class leaned in closer, their earlier confidence replaced by focused curiosity, their posture changing subtly as they tried to replicate what they were seeing, but without the same ease, without the same clarity. One of the advanced students attempted the motion with his partner, his movements sharper, more forceful, but the result was not the same, the flow breaking halfway through, the balance not fully transferring, and he paused, frowning slightly, realizing that what Evelyn had done was not something that could be copied by effort alone. Brad stepped forward slowly, his presence no longer commanding attention automatically, but drawing it through something quieter, something more deliberate, and as he approached, he watched not just the outcome, but the process, the transitions, the subtle timing that connected each movement. "Do it again," he said, but this time his voice carried no challenge, only intent. Evelyn glanced at him briefly, then nodded, repositioning with the same calm precision, and as she moved once more, even slower, breaking the motion into smaller parts, the entire room seemed to follow each detail, each shift of weight, each moment where control replaced tension. "You are trying to control the other person," she said, her voice steady, reaching beyond just her partner now. "But you cannot control something you do not understand first." And the words settled into the room with a different kind of weight, not as instruction, but as realization. The advanced student tried again, this time adjusting his approach, reducing force, focusing instead on timing. And though it was not perfect, something changed, something closer to what they had seen, and he looked up, surprised, as if discovering a different layer beneath what he thought he already knew. The younger woman smiled slightly, her confidence growing, not from success alone, but from understanding, and around them, the room shifted again, not in hierarchy, but in mindset, the focus turning inward rather than outward, each person measuring their own movement instead of comparing it to others. Brad remained still for a moment, watching, then spoke quietly, almost to himself. It looks simple, and Evelyn met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, her response equally quiet. It is, once you stop trying to make it complicated. And there was no arrogance in her tone, no need to prove anything further, only the quiet certainty of someone who had spent years refining something others were only beginning to see. The room did not react with laughter or doubt this time, only with a deeper silence, one filled not with tension, but with attention, and in that silence, the lesson settled more clearly than any demonstration could have forced, that true control was not about overpowering, but about understanding, and those who understood the most often spoke the least. The room had changed in a way no one could ignore, not louder, not more intense, but sharper, as if every movement now carried meaning that had been invisible just minutes before, and as pairs continued to train, the difference was clear: less force, more awareness, less rush, more control, all of it quietly echoing what Evelyn had shown without ever needing to repeat it again. She stepped back slightly, giving space to the others, her role returning to observer. Yet her presence lingered at the center of every movement unfolding across the mat. Brad watched it all carefully, his arms relaxed at his sides, his attention no longer fixed on dominance or correction, but on understanding, and for the first time since the class had begun, he was not leading the room, he was learning from it. He turned his head slightly, scanning the students as they adjusted, noticing how even the most experienced among them had slowed down, their confidence replaced by something more deliberate, something more thoughtful, and that realization settled heavily, not as frustration, but as recognition. He stepped closer to Evelyn, stopping just a few feet away, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, yet carrying a sincerity that had not been there before. "You have done this for a long time," he said, not as a question, but as a statement shaped by what he had witnessed, and Evelyn met his gaze calmly, offering the same quiet acknowledgement she had given all along. "Long enough to stop proving it," she replied, her tone even, her words simple, but the meaning beneath them deeper than anything spoken in the room so far. Brad nodded slowly, absorbing that, and for a brief moment, there was no hierarchy between them, no instructor and newcomer, only two people standing on the same mat, recognizing something real in each other. Around them, one of the advanced students paused mid-movement, then looked over, his expression thoughtful. "Is there a name for that transition?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention again, and a few others turned as well, waiting, curious not for validation this time, but for knowledge. Evelyn considered the question for a second, then shook her head slightly. "There are many names," she said, "but names do not matter if you do not understand what makes it work." And the answer, instead of disappointing them, seemed to pull them in further, as if they were beginning to see beyond labels and into something more fundamental. The younger woman stepped forward again, her earlier hesitation completely gone now, replaced by quiet confidence. "Can you teach us that?" she asked, and the simplicity of the question carried a kind of honesty that shifted the room once more. Evelyn glanced around, taking in the faces, the attention, the openness that had replaced judgment, and for the first time, a faint smile appeared, small but unmistakable. "I can show you," she said, and there was no claim in her voice, no declaration of authority, only an offer, one that everyone in the room felt immediately. Brad stepped back, slightly, giving space without being asked, and that single movement spoke louder than anything else, not a loss of control, but a choice to let something better take its place. The class gathered closer, forming a loose circle around Evelyn, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to see, to understand, to feel what they had missed before, and as the room settled into that quiet focus, it became clear that something had shifted far beyond a single demonstration, something deeper than technique, something that would stay with them long after the class ended, and in that stillness, the difference between showing off and truly knowing had never been more obvious. The circle tightened around Evelyn, not out of pressure, but out of genuine attention, every person on that mat now leaning into something they had not expected to find when they walked in that afternoon. And as she stepped into the center, there was no announcement, no shift in tone, only a quiet readiness that drew everyone in without effort. "Watch your own balance first," she said, her voice calm, steady, guiding rather than instructing. And as she demonstrated again, her movements slower now, more deliberate, it became clear that what she was showing was not a move, but a way of seeing, a way of feeling the subtle changes that happened before anything visible occurred. One student tried to follow along, then another, their motions less rigid than before, their focus turned inward, and for the first time, mistakes were not met with frustration, but with curiosity. "Do not rush," Evelyn added softly, adjusting the angle of one student's stance with the lightest touch, barely noticeable, yet instantly effective, and the student paused, surprised, not because something had been corrected, but because something had been understood. Brad stood just outside the circle now, watching closely, his earlier authority replaced by a quiet respect that did not need to be announced. And as he observed the way Evelyn moved through the group, guiding without imposing, he began to see the difference he had missed before, the difference between teaching to demonstrate knowledge and teaching to reveal it in others. One of the black belts stepped forward, his expression thoughtful, his tone respectful. "Can I try with you?" he asked, and there was no challenge in his voice, only a desire to understand what he had just witnessed. Evelyn nodded, stepping into position once more, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and as they moved together, the entire room leaned in again, not expecting a repeat of what had happened earlier, but something deeper, something more refined. The exchange was brief, almost quiet, a series of small adjustments, subtle shifts, and within seconds, the black belt paused mid-motion, his expression shifting as realization replaced effort, and he stepped back on his own, nodding slowly. "I see it," he said, more to himself than to anyone else, and that moment carried more weight than any demonstration could have forced. The younger woman smiled, her confidence growing not from success alone, but from understanding, and around them, others began to experience the same shift, each small realization building into something larger, something shared. Brad finally stepped forward again, stopping just inside the circle, his voice calm, measured. "What you showed today," he said, looking directly at Evelyn, "that is not something you learn in a few classes," and there was no skepticism left in his tone, only acknowledgement. Evelyn met his gaze briefly, then looked back at the group, her expression thoughtful. "It is not about how long you train," she said quietly. "It is about how you pay attention," and the words settled into the room with a clarity that needed no explanation. The circle remained still for a moment, no one speaking, no one moving, as if everyone was holding on to that understanding just a little longer, and in that silence, something deeper took root, something that would stay with them far beyond this one class, a shift not just in technique, but in perspective, and as the room slowly began to move again, it was clear that they were not the same students who had walked in, and they were no longer looking at Evelyn as someone who did not belong, but as someone who had quietly changed the way they saw everything. The room did not break apart right away, even as the lesson seemed to settle into a natural pause. No one rushed back to routine, no one returned to casual chatter, because something more important than drills had taken hold, something quieter but far more lasting. And as Evelyn stepped back from the center once again, the space she left behind did not feel empty, it felt charged with understanding. Brad looked around at his students, really looked this time, noticing the difference in their posture, the way they carried themselves, less rigid, more aware, and for the first time in a long time, he realized that what had just happened was not a disruption, but a correction, not to them alone, but to him as well. He took a slow breath, then addressed the room, his voice steady, but stripped of its earlier certainty. "We are going to reset," he said, and the words landed gently, not as an order, but as an acknowledgement that something had changed. The students nodded, repositioning themselves, but now their movements were quieter, more thoughtful, as if they were listening to something beneath the surface of their actions. Evelyn remained near the edge of the mat, her presence calm, no longer at the center of attention, yet still shaping the room without effort, and the younger woman stayed close by, watching her with a kind of quiet focus that had replaced all earlier doubt. One of the students approached Brad, his voice low. "Coach, have you seen that before?" The question was simple, but it carried weight, and Brad paused before answering, not because he did not know, but because he was choosing his words more carefully now. "Not like that," he admitted, his tone honest, and that honesty alone shifted something else in the room, something about leadership that did not rely on always having the answer. The student nodded, satisfied not by certainty, but by truth, and stepped back onto the mat with a renewed sense of focus. Across the room, pairs began moving again, but the difference was undeniable: less force, more patience, less proving, more learning, and every now and then, someone would pause, adjust, and try again, not because they were told to, but because they wanted to understand what they had just witnessed. Brad's gaze returned to Evelyn, who stood quietly, observing once more, and there was a moment where he seemed to consider something. Then he walked over, stopping just beside her. "You could teach here," he said, his voice low, sincere, not as a test, not as a challenge, but as a recognition of what she had brought into that space. Evelyn looked at him, her expression calm, thoughtful, and for a second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for her response. She glanced back at the students, watching them move, watching them try, watching them learn, and then she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "They are already learning," she said quietly, and the simplicity of her answer carried more weight than any acceptance could have. Brad nodded slowly, understanding that what she offered was not something that could be assigned or scheduled. It was something that appeared when it was needed, and disappeared just as quietly. The younger woman stepped closer again, her voice soft. "Will you come back?" she asked, and this time, there was no hesitation in her tone, only hope. Evelyn looked at her, then at the room once more, and a faint smile touched her lips. "If it matters," she replied, and the answer lingered in the air, not as a promise, but as a reflection of everything they had just experienced. The room continued to move, but now with purpose, with awareness, with a kind of respect that had not been there before, and as the afternoon light shifted across the mats, it became clear that what had changed was not just how they trained, but how they saw. And once that changes, it does not easily go back. The class continued, but it no longer felt like the same place it had been an hour ago. The sharp edges of ego softened into something quieter, something more grounded, and as the students moved through their drills, there was a noticeable shift in the way they interacted. Less competition, more awareness, less noise, more intention, as if each person had become responsible not just for their own movement, but for how they affected the space around them. Evelyn remained near the edge, her posture relaxed, her attention steady, and though she said nothing, her presence still guided the rhythm of the room in a way no instruction ever could. Brad stood a few steps away, watching everything unfold, and there was a stillness in him now that had not been there before, not uncertainty, but reflection, the kind that comes when something familiar is quietly redefined. He glanced at the clock on the wall, noting how much time had passed, though it felt different, not measured in minutes, but in moments that had reshaped the entire session. "Bring it in," he called out, his voice calm, and the class responded immediately, gathering at the center of the mat, forming a loose semicircle, their attention focused, not out of habit, but out of genuine interest in what would come next. Brad looked at them for a moment before speaking, as if choosing not just his words, but his tone, his approach, and when he finally did, there was no trace of the earlier certainty, only honesty. "Today was different," he said, and a few students nodded subtly, their expressions reflecting the same thought. And that is a good thing. The statement settled into the room, simple, but meaningful, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one shifted, they just listened. Brad continued, his gaze moving across the group, then briefly toward Evelyn before returning. "We spend a lot of time trying to get better," he said, "but sometimes we forget to understand what we are doing while we are getting there." And the words carried more weight now because of what they had all witnessed. One of the students raised his hand slightly, then lowered it, unsure if the moment called for questions or simply reflection, and Brad noticed, giving a small nod of acknowledgement without breaking the flow. "Control is not about force," he added, "and it is not about speed," and there was a brief pause as he let that settle, It is about awareness. And this time, no one needed clarification. The younger woman glanced toward Evelyn, her expression thoughtful, then back to Brad, connecting the lesson to the experience in real time. Brad took another breath, then said something that surprised even himself. "We had a guest today," he said, and a few students smiled slightly, understanding immediately who he meant, "And whether she comes back or not, what she showed you should stay with you." And there was no need to elaborate further. The room held that thought in silence, a shared understanding passing between them without words. Evelyn did not step forward, did not respond. She simply stood where she was, her presence unchanged, her role complete without needing recognition. Brad looked at her once more, not expecting anything, just acknowledging, and she returned the look with the same quiet composure. Nothing more, nothing less. The class began to disperse slowly, conversations starting again, but softer now, more reflective, as students gathered their things, exchanged thoughts, and replayed moments in their minds, trying to hold on to what they had felt rather than just what they had seen. And as the room gradually returned to motion, it was clear that something had shifted beneath the surface, something that would continue to influence every step they took from that day forward, even after the mats were cleared and the lights were turned off. The room gradually emptied, but the energy did not leave with the students. It lingered in the quiet space between the mats, in the softened echoes of footsteps, in the way the air itself seemed to hold on to something that had not been there before. And as the last few conversations faded toward the exit, Evelyn Carter remained near the edge, calmly folding the sleeves of her uniform, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The younger woman hesitated near the door, glancing back one more time, then walked over with a small, almost uncertain smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere, not just for the demonstration, but for something she could not fully put into words yet. Evelyn looked at her, her expression gentle, steady. "Keep paying attention," she replied, and the simplicity of it landed deeper than any detailed explanation could have, the kind of advice that would grow over time rather than impress in the moment. The younger woman nodded, holding on to that, then turned and left, carrying something new with her, something invisible but undeniable. Across the room, Brad stood alone for a moment, looking down at the mat where everything had shifted, his reflection faintly visible in the polished surface beneath the overhead lights. And for the first time in a long while, he was not thinking about what to teach next, but about what he needed to unlearn. He walked slowly toward Evelyn, stopping a few feet away, not out of distance, but out of respect, and there was a pause before he spoke, as if choosing honesty over habit. "I almost sent you away," he said quietly, and the admission carried weight, not heavy, but real, and Evelyn met his gaze without judgment, without surprise. "You did not," she replied, her tone calm, neither dismissing nor emphasizing the moment, simply acknowledging it as it was. Brad let out a small breath, something between a laugh and a realization. "I thought I understood what I was seeing," he continued, his eyes briefly scanning the now quiet room, "but I was only looking at the surface." And that recognition seemed to settle into him more than anything else that had happened that day. Evelyn adjusted the knot of her belt again, a small, habitual motion, then looked back at him. "Most people do," she said, not as criticism, but as truth, and the words landed softly, without resistance. Brad nodded slowly, accepting that without defense, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them no longer tense, but clear, like something that had been resolved without needing to be explained further. Outside, the late afternoon light had shifted into something warmer, casting longer shadows through the windows, stretching across the mat in quiet lines that mirrored the stillness inside. Evelyn picked up her bag, simple, worn, and slung it gently over her shoulder, her movements unhurried, unremarkable, yet carrying a quiet finality that made the moment feel complete. Brad watched her for a second, then asked, not out of authority, but out of genuine curiosity, "Will I see you again?" And the question hung there, not demanding an answer, but hoping for one. Evelyn paused near the door, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she looked back over her shoulder, her expression calm, thoughtful. "That depends," she said softly, and there was a slight pause before she added, "on whether you keep paying attention." And with that, she stepped out into the fading light, leaving the door open just long enough for the silence behind her to settle into something lasting, something that would remain long after she was gone, not as a memory of what she did, but as a reminder of what they had failed to see before she arrived. The door closed softly behind Evelyn Carter, and for a moment, the entire space seemed to hold its breath, as if something important had just passed through and left behind more than anyone could fully grasp yet. And Brad stood there, his hand resting lightly at his side, his eyes still fixed on the spot where she had been, not out of disbelief, but out of recognition, the kind that comes too late to change the moment, but just in time to change what comes after it. The gym was quiet now, the earlier energy replaced by a calm stillness that felt unfamiliar yet welcome, and as the overhead lights hummed faintly above, Brad slowly walked back toward the center of the mat, each step measured, thoughtful, as if he were stepping into a place he thought he knew, only to realize it had always been deeper than he allowed himself to see. He crouched down slightly, running his hand across the mat, feeling the surface beneath his fingertips, the same surface where countless lessons had been taught, where countless assumptions had been reinforced, and now, quietly, undone. Across the room, one of the students who had stayed behind adjusted his belt, then paused, watching Brad with a different kind of attention than before. "Coach," he said, his voice careful. That changed things, did it not?" Brad did not answer right away. He stood slowly, taking a breath, then looked around the room, really seeing it now, not as a place he controlled, but as a place that could still teach him. "It did," he said finally, his voice steady, grounded in something more honest than before. "More than you realize." The student nodded, holding on to that, and stepped back, leaving Brad alone again in the center. The silence returned, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full of everything that had not been said, everything that had been shown instead. And as Brad walked toward the edge of the mat, he stopped where Evelyn had first stood, that same quiet spot where he had judged her without understanding, and he let that realization settle fully this time, without resistance, without excuse. Outside, the evening light stretched across the parking lot, soft and fading, and inside, the gym held onto the last traces of warmth from the day, as if unwilling to let go just yet. Brad glanced toward the door once more, not expecting her to return, not needing her to, because what she had left behind was already enough. He turned back to the mat, his posture different now, less rigid, more aware, and as he took one final look around the room, there was a quiet certainty in his expression, not about what he knew, but about what he had yet to learn. The lights dimmed slightly as the timer clicked over, and the space settled into stillness, the kind that follows something meaningful, something that does not need to be repeated to be remembered, and in that stillness, the lesson remained, not written, not spoken, but understood, that true strength does not announce itself, it reveals itself, quietly, precisely, and only to those willing to see it. And that day, for the first time, they all did.